Well, hi there, and welcome to this week's Bible study. Thank you for joining with us, and I hope that you are all keeping well. Even as lockdown begins to ease and certain restrictions are being lifted, I hope that you are still making your safety and the safety of others a top priority. We're going to look at Psalm 23 today, a psalm that for many of us is familiar. When speaking about Psalm 23, the theologian James Montgomery Boyce says that it has charmed more griefs to rest than any of the philosophy that this world has to offer. For some, the words of this psalm have been the last that they have ever uttered in this life. This is a psalm that many of us are familiar with, and it is good for us to come and look at it again, maybe just with different eyes today. The title of the psalm, like so many other psalms in the first book of this collection of prayers and songs and hymns, is a Psalm of David. And that's important for us to start from, because it reminds us that this is a psalm that is written by a king who once was a shepherd. And so as he looks at his relationship with God, he understands it the way he understood his relationship as a shepherd with the sheep that were in his care. It's not the first time in the Old Testament that God is described as a shepherd. The imagery of God being a shepherd goes all the way back to Genesis 49 verse 24. When Moses talks about God as a shepherd, the stone of Israel. And some of the earliest Christian imagery of Jesus is as a shepherd with a lamb slung across his shoulders. So we're going to read Psalm 23 now, and the version that we're going to use for this study is the New Revised Standard Version, but from time to time we will refer to the familiar King James Version of this psalm. So let's read the psalm together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. We're going to look at this psalm in little mini chunks. But before we jump into the first bit, I think I've mentioned before, and if I have, I want to remind you that when we come across the word Lord in the Old Testament, and it is written in capital letters, the way it is in the first verse, that is the original Hebrew being translated to the word Lord, but the original appears as the name of God, as Yahweh. So when we see that word written that way, it is an English translation for Yahweh. So what David is saying here is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God who is his shepherd, Yahweh. The first bit that we're going to look at tells us about how God is a shepherd who nurtures and cares and provides for his sheep. And the psalm begins with these words. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Right from the start, David recognizes that his relationship with God is a personal relationship. The shepherd might be a shepherd over all the flock, as God is the God of all people. But such is David's relationship with God that he can call him my shepherd, knowing that David is one of God's sheep that he loves and knows full well. And David recognizes that as a shepherd, God provides all that he needs. But more than that, David recognizes that whatever God hasn't provided for him, he has no need of. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I shall not want for what I need, and I shall not want for the things that God hasn't provided for me. David knows to desire the things that God hasn't provided for him risks him breaking the 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's house or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. And so when we say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, we are choosing not to desire more than what God has given us. And what the shepherd provides for his sheep is green pastures to lie down in, and still waters where they may find rest, and where they will feel restored. In his book called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23, Philip Keller writes this. He says that sheep do not lie down easily, and not unless 4 conditions are met. Because they are timid, they will not lie down if they are afraid. Because they are social animals, they will not lie down if there is any conflict amongst the sheep. If flies or parasites trouble them, they will not lie down. And finally, if sheep are anxious about food and are hungry, they will not lie down. Rest only comes for the sheep because the shepherd has dealt with fear, with friction, with flies, and with famine. And so God is a God who provides not just for our physical needs, but for our mental and our social needs too. And then in verse 3, David goes on to say this. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. The effect of the shepherd leading his sheep and providing them with rest and all that they need is that David feels that his soul has been restored. James Boyce says that in the Hebrew, the words restores my soul can also mean brings me to repentance, turns me away from a life of sin and towards a life of righteousness. When we restore something, we bring it back to its original state. To have our souls restored is to bring them back to the original state of purity and unity with God. It is the work of the shepherd, not the sheep, that brings them to this place of righteousness. The shepherd leads them along the paths of righteousness. The role of the sheep is to faithfully respond to the call of the shepherd. And not only does the shepherd restore our souls, but the shepherd also leads us along paths of righteousness. Again, as we have mentioned in previous Psalms, and I'm thinking of Psalm 1 and the study we did on Psalm 1 when I'm talking about this, is that righteousness doesn't come from what we do. We don't earn or we don't perform enough to become righteous. Our righteousness comes through what Jesus has done on the cross, and we become righteous when we place our faith in him. And so what we see here is it isn't the sheep that brings about their own righteousness, but when they follow the call of the shepherd on the journey that he is leading them on. It is our shepherd that leads us to our place of righteousness, and he does it for his name's sake. Through the work of Jesus on the cross, God brings us to a place or a state of righteousness, not for our own glory. After all, we've done nothing to earn it or deserve it, but for his glory. And it makes me think of what Paul writes to the Ephesians in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, when it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast." But it's not only to green pastures and still waters and paths of righteousness that the shepherd leads his sheep. The shepherd also leads his sheep to the darker parts of our journey in life. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This verse reminds us that even though we follow a good shepherd, we will still encounter difficult times in our lives. We will still find ourselves at times journeying through the darkest valley, or as the King James Version calls it, the valley of the shadow of death. On the Blue Letter Bible website, in his commentary on Psalm 23, David Guzik makes two important points for us to remember as we read this verse. Firstly, we journey through the valley of the shadow of death. We pass through it. We don't remain there. It isn't a destination or a final resting place. The valley of the shadow of death is just a part of our journey, and our shepherd walks with us through it. The second thing is that it is the shadow of death. It is not death itself that we need fear or that we encounter. Death can only cast its shadow across our paths because Jesus has taken the full reality of death upon himself and has been victorious over death. And so we can declare with Paul when he writes to the Corinthian church, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" And then David says, "I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Following Jesus doesn't eliminate evil from our lives, but it does eliminate the fear of evil, because he is always with us, and he has already been victorious over evil and all the effects that it has on our eternal lives. And we find comfort in his tools of the trade that he brings with him. The shepherd comes with his rod and his staff. Now, whether David was referring to these as two separate instruments or one single instrument, what is clear is that the rod and the staff have two purposes. One is to protect and the other is to lead. And it makes me think of Paul's description of the armor of God. Helmets and breastplates and belts that protect us, and feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace that lead us and guide us. And as we think of these things that Jesus comes equipped with as he guides us through dark valleys and through evil times, we are reminded once again that the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. I shall not want for protection and I shall not want for guidance when things are hard. And then we come to verse 5, where David still finds himself in the darker times of his life, but still he is not alone, and still he is not in need. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Again, we see that even though we journey on a path that the Good Shepherd leads us on, we are not exempt from encountering danger and evil and enemies who seek to destroy us. And yet, even in the midst of enemies, in the midst of danger, we still encounter God's blessing. The shepherd who hosts the meal doesn't look to eliminate the enemy, but rather prepares a meal even in the midst, in the presence of enemies. And so even though the enemy threatens, we can still receive and experience God's goodness and God's blessing in the middle of troubled times. In the middle of danger, in the middle of threats, David finds himself truly blessed by God. He is well fed. It is a table that is prepared. It's not a takeout that Jesus prepares for him to carry on the journey with him, but a well-prepared table. He is well watered. His cup overflows. He has no thirst because God will make sure that his thirst is quenched. And he is refreshed as his head is anointed with oil. And finally, in verse 6, David acknowledges that it is not just for a season that God is his shepherd, not even just for this entire life that he lives here on earth, but God is our shepherd for all eternity, as we read in verse 6. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Or as the King James Version translates it, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Our God is a good God. Our God is a merciful God. And so when we follow the shepherd, when we allow the Lord to be our shepherd, then his goodness and his mercy follows us wherever we go, and we can encounter it in every situation. We will always experience God's goodness and God's mercy in this life and the life that lies beyond the grave. The Lord is our shepherd, we shall not want, in this life and in the life to come. I hope that you have enjoyed this week's Bible study. I hope that it has been a blessing to you, that the things that we have spoken about as we've looked back at the psalm, maybe a psalm that, as I've said in the past, might be familiar with you or familiar to you. Something new has just become a reality to you in reading the psalm and studying it together. We're going to meet again in 2 weeks' time. We know that things are starting to change with lockdown, that things are starting to be eased, but we will continue with these Bible studies in the weeks that lie ahead of us. And the next time that we meet together, we are going to look at Psalm 31. Psalm 31 together the next time we meet. It's lovely to have been able to share with you again. And I do look forward to doing that sometime in the future, in a couple of weeks. Next week, Michael Miller will be with us. So take care of yourself, stay safe, even in the midst of the easing of lockdowns. Make your safety and the safety of others a priority. May God bless you, and may God watch over you in the days and the weeks that lie ahead. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.